Welcome to the first podcast edition of Mapping with Atlas. I used Google's Notebook LM, a new AI tool, to make this artificial podcast based on the content of my book, A Metarevolutionary Manifesto. And now, the podcast. Enjoy.
You shared Evan Tabak-Atlas's Metarevolutionary Manifesto with me, and he calls this whole tangled web of problems a metacrisis.
Right.
It's not just one problem, but it's a system where all these problems feed off of each other.
Yeah, and that's what makes it so difficult to even think about. Because if you think about historical revolutions, right, they typically targeted one thing, right, a government or an economic system. But when the problems are all interconnected like this, it's very hard to know where to even begin. And Atlas would argue that the old revolutionary tactics just simply aren't effective anymore. You can't just change one thing and expect the whole system to magically fix itself.
Because it's so interconnected.
Exactly. It's like we're constantly playing whack-a-mole with all these problems, but they're all connected under the surface.
That's a good way to put it.
So if that's the case, if we are really dealing with this metacrisis, where do we even begin? How do we address something so honestly overwhelming?
Well, this source material really argues that the old ways of thinking, just trying to isolate each crisis and tackle them one by one.
Yeah, the whole divide and conquer approach.
Exactly. That just won't cut it in this new reality.
It's like trying to put out a forest fire one tree at a time.
Yeah, that's a great way to think about it. We need a new approach, something way more holistic, something that really recognizes that interconnectedness we were talking about.
So we need a new approach. But what does that even look like in action? I noticed the source material uses a really interesting term, metarevolution. What's the difference between a regular revolution and a meta-revolution?
Revolutions, well, they often focus on single issues, right? On replacing one system with another.
They're just swapping out the players but not changing the game.
Right, and it's like they're addressing those symptoms without ever really understanding what's causing them in the first place.
They're putting a Band-Aid on a much deeper wound.
A much deeper wound, exactly. Now, meta-revolution, that's about understanding the root cause.
Okay, so revolutionaries are looking for a quick fix, a quick overturn, while meta-revolutionaries are in it for the long haul, trying to understand the whole system.
It's like realizing we don't just need a new engine, we need a completely new way to power vehicles, period.
We need to rethink the whole system.
Exactly. Meta-revolution is about questioning all those fundamental assumptions, those things that underpin everything, from our systems to our values.
We're talking about a pretty radical shift in perspective.
Absolutely.
And this brings us to, well, a pretty interesting metaphor in the source material. The zombie apocalypse. I'll fully admit when I first read that, I was like, okay, where is this going? But honestly, it's actually a really interesting way to think about meaninglessness in our current world.
It really is. It might seem a little out there at first.
Yeah, a little out there.
Think about, that classic image of a zombie, right? Mindless, insatiable, just driven by that primal urge to consume.
Like an eating machine.
Yeah, exactly. And the source material says that image really reflects that feeling a lot of people are dealing with today, that crisis of meaning, that feeling of emptiness.
It's like going through the motions, doing all the things, but there's no real purpose driving it, like something's missing.
Exactly. You just feel it, but you can't quite put your finger on what it is. And, the scariest part, that sense of meaninglessness, it's actually contagious.
Like a virus.
Like a virus, yeah. It spreads from person to person. It starts to influence everything, our relationships, our institutions.
You think we're all slowly turning into zombies.
In a way, yeah.
Yeah.
And that's what makes it even harder to deal with the problems in front of us. It's like that zombie virus is making it hard to think clearly, hard to even work together to find solutions.
It's a pretty bleak picture.
Yeah, but luckily, the source material doesn't leave us completely without hope. It offers an antidote. It says the key to fighting the zombie apocalypse of meaninglessness is to rediscover the good.
Okay, the good. Now, what exactly does that mean? We're talking about religion here, or morality.
Well, that's what we'll explore next.
So how does this source material actually define the good? How does it get us out of this feeling of societal aimlessness we've been talking about?
Well, they really go deep on it, suggesting we need to rediscover the good, not as some rigid set of rules.
Right, and not the 10 Commandments of the good.
Exactly. Not a moral code, not some religious dogma. It's more like a fundamental principle, a principle of value and meaning.
Okay, so it runs deeper than just do this, don't do that.
Much deeper. It's about recognizing something inherently beneficial, something that applies to all of humanity.
So not just good for me, but good on a much larger scale.
Exactly. A universal good, you could say.
But we live in a world where everyone seems to have their own version of good. How can we even begin to find common ground when there's so much, disagreement?
That's the million-dollar question, isn't it? And the source material acknowledges that. It kind of suggests we've lost our way a bit. And to understand where we are now, we need to look back at where we've been.
Okay, so we're going back in time, looking at how good has evolved through different periods of history.
That's the idea. For a long time, traditional religions provided the framework for understanding the good. But in the modern era, with science and reason becoming more central.
People started questioning those old ways of thinking.
Exactly. Those frameworks, they started to break down, and then postmodernism came along, questioning everything.
And I imagine that led to a whole lot of, nihilism. Like, if nothing is objectively true, then is there even such a thing as the good?
That's exactly what the source material points out, but it also says that brings us to where we are now, the metamodern era.
Metamodernism. I've heard that term thrown around, but I'm not going to lie, it kind of makes my head spin a little. What's the metamodern take on the good?
I hear you, it's a mouthful. And think of it this way. Modernism was all about absolute truth, black and white thinking. And then postmodernism came along and threw paint all over that.
So everything's gray now.
Well, metamodernism is like the pendulum swinging back towards meaning and purpose, but in a way that recognizes those gray areas.
So it's not about going back to those old rigid ways of thinking.
Not at all. It's about embracing complexity, understanding that there might not be one right answer.
So instead of clinging to those rigid beliefs or just giving into cynicism, metamodernism is about finding a new way to approach the good in a world that feels, let's be honest, pretty chaotic.
You got it. And the source material really emphasizes how essential that metamodern perspective is, especially now, for navigating this metacrisis.
Because it lets us hold multiple ideas at once, be open to new ways of thinking.
Exactly. It allows us to embrace the idea that we're all in this together, figuring it out as we go.
And that makes me think about another metaphor from the source material. Flatland. Remember that book? About those two-dimensional shapes who couldn't even comprehend a third dimension.
A classic.
Yeah.
And such a powerful metaphor for how limited our thinking can be.
So we get so stuck in our own ways of seeing the world that we miss the bigger picture?
That's it. We get so focused on the details of our own lives that we don't see the larger forces at play.
We're so busy staring at the trees, we miss the entire forest.
And the source material argues that metamodernism is about breaking free from that flatland. It's about developing a way more expansive, holistic worldview.
So recognizing that there might be dimensions we can't even perceive with our current limited way of thinking.
Exactly. It's about opening our minds to possibilities we haven't even imagined.
That sounds honestly a little daunting. How do we even begin to break free from that? It's not like we can just snap our fingers and suddenly see everything in a new light.
You're right. It's not about magic. The source material suggests it starts with awareness, recognizing that our way of seeing things might be limited.
Accepting that we might not have all the answers.
And being open to new ideas. The source material even talks about finding guidance from some pretty unexpected sources, things like mythology and symbolism.
Okay, now we're going deep. What do ancient myths have to do with navigating this metacrisis? I'm intrigued.
It might seem like a stretch at first, but think about it. Those stories, those myths, they're not just entertainment. They're maps of the human experience.
They're trying to tell us something.
Exactly. They're packed with wisdom about our place in the universe, good and evil, what it means to be human. Those insights are timeless, universal.
So it's like they offer a different language, a language of symbols, to help us make sense of everything.
You got it. And the source material suggests that somewhere along the way, we lost touch with that language. We became so fixated on the literal, the material world, that we forgot the power of these deeper meanings.
It's like we traded in our telescopes for microscopes, so focused on the tiny details that we can't see the constellations anymore.
That's a great way to put it. And that loss of connection, that's a big part of the problem.
So how do we reclaim that connection? How do we learn to read those ancient maps again?
Now, that is where things get really interesting.
So we're trying to rediscover this power of myth and metaphor. It's definitely fascinating, but I gotta admit, I'm still a little fuzzy on how it all connects back to, actually navigating this meta crisis, actually creating a better future.
How do we actually take all this and turn it into action? How do we go from just observing everything to actually shaping a better future?
It's like we need that bridge between these big ideas and our everyday lives.
Totally. And the source material actually offers some pretty intriguing answers. It talks about how transformation happens on two levels, both personally and collectively.
Okay, two sides of the same coin.
Yeah, exactly. On a personal level, it's about recognizing that we're all centers of action.
Centers of action, I like that. Like, we actually have power. We have a role to play.
Exactly. It means we're not just along for the ride. We can make choices, and those choices have ripple effects.
So even our smallest actions contribute to either making the meta crisis worse or fueling the meta revolution.
Precisely. But it's not just about individual action in isolation. That's where the collective level comes in.
We can't just go off into our own little corners and hope it all works out.
Exactly. We need to create systems and structures together. We need communities that support meaning and a shared sense of purpose.
And this makes me think about how the source material talks about traditional religions breaking down and these sort of pseudo-religions popping up in their place.
Oh, that's a really interesting connection.
Things like consumerism, nationalism, even like those really intense online communities.
It's like we have this deep human need for belonging, right? For something bigger than ourselves. And when those old structures crumble, we look for new ones, even if they're not necessarily healthy.
It's like we're searching for meaning, but sometimes end up lost in the sauce.
The source material really challenges us to find those new ways to belong, to connect, but in a way that leads to a more just and sustainable world, a world that actually works for everyone.
Wow, this has been a really insightful deep dive. I feel like I have a whole new vocabulary for understanding the challenges, but also the possibilities, right?
It's not about having all the answers. It's about staying curious, staying engaged.
And remembering that we're all in this together. The more we connect with each other, share our experiences, support each other.
The stronger we become.
Exactly. Thanks for joining us for this deep dive into the meta crisis and the meta revolution. We'll be back next week with another exploration of these big ideas shaping our world. Until then, keep asking those questions, keep challenging those assumptions, and keep searching for those glimmers of hope and possibility out there.
All right, get ready to dive into some seriously heavy stuff today. Complexity. And we're not just, talking complexity in general. You've given me all this, material on this idea of a meta crisis. It's like, is everything just connected or?
Yeah. It's not even just that these crises are happening at the same time. It's the stuff you've given me is really interesting because it highlights how they're all connected. You all feed into each other, creating like a system that's, how do I put it? More than the sum of its parts.
Well, okay. So how do we even wrap our heads around this? What makes something, complex instead of just complicated? Is it just like a matter of scale?
That's a really good question because it's a super important difference. It's like, think about, if you took apart a really complicated watch, you laid out all the gears and the springs, that's complicated. But you haven't really understood, time or how to keep time just from that.
Yeah, you've just got a bunch of tiny watch parts.
Exactly. So complexity is more about the relationship between those parts.
So applying that to this meta crisis thing, does that mean we're thinking about all the little crises like they're in a conversation with each other?
Exactly. Yeah. It's like the interactions between all of those individual crises, like how they talk to each other, the feedback loops, the things that pop up out of them that create this meta crisis. It's like, if you dissected a living thing, you might understand how all the organs work, like by themselves, but you'd miss the life that comes from how they all work together.
Okay. So it's not enough to just break down all these global problems into smaller, more, manageable chunks.
Right. And that, that's what makes this so interesting. That's where guys like Irvin Laszlo come in. He's saying that understanding complex systems means we need to look at it from a totally different point of view. We have to move away from reductionism, and look at it more holistically.
So we have to zoom out and look at the whole, the whole web and try to find the patterns. But that seems really hard. So where do we even start?
The sources you gave me actually have some good frameworks for this. One of them breaks down complexity into key units, like building blocks. Let's look at a couple. I'm curious what you think after reading all this stuff. One thing that comes up is states.
Okay, states, like different ways of being.
Yeah, like think about an ecosystem. A forest can be in a bunch of different states.
Yeah.
Lush and green, completely burned down by a fire, recovering. Each state has its own characteristics, even though it's the same forest. Complex systems like societies, even our own minds can be in a ton of different states. And the more possible states there are, the more complex it is.
So more variety, more complexity, makes sense.
Yeah.
Does that mean the metacrisis itself can be in different states?
Yeah. Exactly. And it brings up an important question. What state is the metacrisis in now? Is it stable? Is it about to explode? Your sources mention this thing called requisite variety.
Okay, requisite variety. Sounds cool. Tell me more.
Basically, requisite variety means that for a system to really deal with complexity, it needs to be complex itself. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
It's like imagine trying to play poker, like high stakes poker, but you only have a basic understanding of the rules.
Yeah, you're going to get crushed.
Exactly. You might get lucky a few times, but in the long run. So the question is, are our systems, the things we rely on, like governments, institutions, even our own mindsets, are they really equipped to deal with something as crazy as a metacrisis?
So not only is there this messed up web of problems, but the tools we have to deal with them might not even work.
Right. And, it gets even harder because we're dealing with so much information. One of the sources you sent was talking about information theory and how important, but also how messed up information flow is in these really complex systems. Think about it. How many times have you felt like you had too much information and you just froze up?
Oh, all the time. Especially now with doom scrolling and constant news. Sometimes I just want to throw my phone in the ocean and just go live in a cabin or something.
It's true. It's imagine a tiny pipe and you're trying to shove a fire hose worth of water through it. That's kind of what it's like when these information systems get too overwhelmed. There's only so much they can handle at once. A bandwidth, if you will. And when it goes over that, things get messy.
Yeah, you could say that again. So
Yeah.
how do we fix that? How do we get better at filtering the signal from the noise?
Right.
Both personally and as a society?
Yeah, that's the million-dollar question. And some of the stuff you gave me suggests we need to rethink how we filter and process information in the first place. Maybe even question the structure of these information channels. But information overload is only one part of it. There's also this other idea that's important in complexity, the idea of energy.
Because you need energy to make anything work.
Exactly. And just like with information, we've only got so much energy to go around, especially with everything going on. Resources are already stretched thin. We have to think about where we're putting our energy, both as individuals and as a society.
So it's about picking what's most important, focusing our energy where we can make the biggest difference.
Exactly. And that gets us to this idea of synergy.
Synergy. Yeah. Remind me what that means again.
Synergy is when different parts of a system work together, and the result is more than just adding up all the parts, 1 + 1 = 3 kind of thing. So the question is, how do we create more synergy? Instead of everyone doing their own thing, can we find solutions that solve a bunch of problems at the same time?
It's like this. Everything is a whole thing, but also just a part of something bigger at the same time. We're individuals, but we're also part of families, communities, societies, the whole planet.
Yeah, exactly. These nested systems are called holacracies, and they show us that there's this delicate balance between what an individual wants and what's good for the group.
Okay, I think I'm starting to get it. But how do we apply this haul-on idea to, the metacrisis? What does that even look like?
Well, it makes you wonder, right? How do we create systems that respect everyone and everything as a whole being, but also work towards, what's good for everybody? What if we thought about humanity as one big haul-on inside this, even bigger haul-on of the planet? How does that change how we think about, what we're supposed to do here? It's pretty deep when you think about it.
So, if humanity is this haul-on, this complex thing nested inside, even bigger complex things, does that mean the way we're used to solving problems, just doesn't work anymore?
It might. Because it's not just about knowing about these pieces, states and haul-ons. It's about how they all work together, how they make the whole system act. And one of the craziest things about complex systems is that they don't always act, in a predictable way.
What do you mean? Give me an example.
Ever heard of the butterfly effect?
Yeah, if a butterfly flaps its wings in, Brazil, It could cause a tornado in Texas, right?
Right. And even though that's kind of a metaphor, it shows how unpredictable these systems can be. Like this nonlinearity makes it almost impossible to know what your actions are going to do in the long run. One thing your sources talked about is how like systems that are really good at this are usually really decentralized. Like there's not just one thing in charge, it's spread out. Think about like a forest, right? It's got tons of different plants and animals, each one doing its own thing. If one type of plant dies, the whole forest doesn't just die, right?
Because there's like backups,
Yeah.
redundancy.
Exactly. And this goes for, human systems too. When only a few people are in charge, the system is only as good as those people. But when, more people have a say, when we're trying different things at the same time, the system can adapt way faster.
So we need to like share the power more.
Yeah, basically.
So, okay, big picture time. If we're really going through this metasystem transition, like some of these articles say, how do we use this complexity stuff to make it through?
Well, the biggest thing is we need to change how we see the world. We can't just try to, control everything anymore. We got to get comfortable with, not knowing what's going to happen. We got to experiment and work together. We got to build systems that are, as complex as the problems we're facing, systems that can learn and, actually get better when things get tough.
This has been intense. My brain is fried.
I know, right? It's a lot. But the important thing isn't to remember every single thing. It's more about, using these ideas to see things in a new way.
I like that. You've definitely given us all something to think about. And to everyone listening, we hope this deep dive made you curious and maybe even a little bit, empowered to look at the world differently. Until next time, keep asking those big questions. Today, we're diving into a concept that might just change how you see the world.
Ooh, I like where this is going. Lay it on me.
We're talking about games.
Games? Like board games, video games? What kind of games are we talking about here?
Not quite. We're talking about the hidden games woven into our everyday lives. Everything from climate change to political instability, even that feeling of just searching for meaning, it's all tangled up together, right? Yeah. And get this, these sources suggest we might actually understand these huge problems better if we think about games.
Okay, you've piqued my interest. So how do these hidden games work?
Well, when we say life is a game, we're not saying it's all fun and easy, right? These sources seem to be talking about something much deeper.
Exactly. They're suggesting that many aspects of life, from our personal choices to how societies function, share characteristics with games. There are players, rules, strategies, and ultimately winners and losers.
So it's less about life being like Monopoly and more about understanding the underlying systems that can help us navigate these complex situations.
Precisely.
So instead of feeling overwhelmed by life's chaos, we can start to see the patterns, anticipate challenges, and make choices that lead to better outcomes.
That's the goal. This isn't just about winning at some abstract game. It's about actively engaging with life, approaching challenges with creativity and adaptability, and ultimately shaping our own destinies.
I love that. But I have to admit, when I first heard about this life as a game concept, part of me was skeptical. Isn't life more about following your heart, taking risks, embracing the unknown?
It absolutely is. But recognizing the game doesn't mean we abandon our values or stop taking risks. It simply means we do so with a deeper understanding of the playing field. Think of it like this. A skilled poker player understands the odds, manages their risks, and knows when to walk away from a bad hand. That doesn't take away from the thrill of the game. It enhances it.
So we're not saying you should analyze every decision to death or treat your relationships like chess matches. It's more about recognizing that in many situations, there are underlying dynamics at play, and understanding those dynamics can help us make more informed choices.
Exactly. It's about leveling up our thinking, becoming more aware of the forces that shape our lives, and ultimately making decisions that align with our values and goals.
And sometimes, maybe even changing the rules of the game entirely. But we might be getting ahead of ourselves.
You're right. Let's not get ahead of ourselves. Before we start rewriting the rule book, we need to understand how the game is currently played.
Exactly. Because as much as we might like to think we're in control, sometimes we find ourselves caught in these systems that seem to have a life of their own. And that's where things get really interesting and maybe a little bit scary. We're starting to see the world through this game theory lens, recognizing the hidden rules and strategies at play. But I have a feeling it's not all sunshine and roses, right?
You're right, it's not. Our sources delve into some of the darker aspects of game theory specifically, these things called game theoretic traps.
Traps. Okay, that sounds ominous. Can you give me an example?
Imagine this. You're scrolling through social media, and you see a friend's post about their amazing vacation, their promotion, their picture-perfect life. You start to feel a twinge of envy, maybe even a little inadequate. So what do? You post something equally impressive, even if it means stretching the truth or portraying a version of yourself that isn't entirely authentic.
Oof, I've been there.
Yeah.
Trying to keep up with the perfectly curated online world.
Yeah.
But how is that a trap?
It's a trap because everyone's doing the same thing. We're all so busy trying to present the best version of ourselves online that we create this endless cycle of comparison and competition.
Right.
In the process, we might end up feeling more anxious, more isolated, and more disconnected from our true selves. Even though individually we might think we're making rational choices to gain likes or followers, collectively we're feeding into a system that can be detrimental to our well-being.
That is so true. And it makes me think about our sources mentioning something called the prisoner's dilemma.
Yeah.
How does that fit into this idea, a trap?
The prisoner's dilemma is a classic example of a game theoretic trap. It goes like this. Two criminals are arrested and held in separate cells, unable to communicate. The police offer each prisoner a deal. If one prisoner betrays the other by confessing, the confessor goes free while the other serves a long sentence. If both stay silent, they both get a shorter sentence.
So they're better off cooperating with each other.
Right. Exactly. But here's the catch. From each prisoner's perspective, betraying their partner seems like the best option, regardless of what the other prisoner does. If prisoner A thinks prisoner B will stay silent, prisoner A is better off betraying and going free. And if prisoner A thinks prisoner B will betray, prisoner A is still better off betraying to avoid a longer sentence.
It's like they're trapped in a system that pushes them towards a lose-lose outcome, even though they'd both be better off cooperating.
Precisely. And that's the insidious nature of these traps. One of our sources had a chilling quote about this. A game theoretic trap, when you get to the planetary scale, is a depersonalizing vortical attractor which grips us in servitude to the worst aspects of ourselves.
Wow, that's heavy. And unfortunately, it feels very real.
Think about the arms race during the Cold War. Each superpower, acting rationally to ensure its own security, ended up stockpiling enough nuclear weapons to destroy the world many times over.
A race to the bottom if there ever was one.
Exactly. And sadly, we see echoes of these traps in so many global challenges today. Climate change is a prime example. We know that collective action is essential, but individual countries and corporations often prioritize their own short-term interests, even if it means jeopardizing the planet's long-term health.
It's like we're all caught in this web of interconnected systems, and even when we recognize the problem, it can feel impossible to break free.
That feeling of being trapped, of being powerless to change the course of events, is at the heart of this concept of Moloch that you mentioned earlier. It represents the destructive force of short-term incentives and that race to the bottom we were just discussing.
It's like a force of nature, this Moloch, pushing us towards outcomes that no one truly desires.
And one of the sources quotes Teilhard de Chardin, who paints a bleak picture of this. Mankind has been brought to a halt at the collective, which is now a terrifying Moloch. We can neither love it nor love one another within it.
It's easy to feel despair when you put it like that. So if we're constantly at risk of falling into these traps, these Molochs, how do we escape? Is there a way to navigate these complex systems without getting crushed?
It's a valid concern. It's easy to get caught in that spiral of helplessness, but our sources offer a glimmer of hope. Even within the seemingly rigid structures of game theory, there are strategies for navigating these complexities, for shifting the odds in our favor.
Okay, I'm listening. Give me some hope here. What can we do?
One surprisingly effective strategy is called tit for tat.
Tit for tat. That sounds less like sophisticated game theory and more like playground retribution. How does that help us deal with global issues or even just navigate our own lives?
Well, it's more nuanced than the name suggests. Essentially, tit for tat is about mirroring the other player's actions. You respond to cooperation with cooperation and defection with defection.
So it's like setting a clear boundary. I'm willing to work with you, but if you try to take advantage, I will stand my ground.
Exactly. And studies have shown that this approach, this balance of being open to cooperation but ready to defend against exploitation, consistently outperforms more aggressive or passive strategies.
Really? So being consistently nice isn't the answer. And being constantly cutthroat backfires. It's about finding that balance.
You got it. And Robert Axelrod, who conducted extensive research on this, outlined 4 key principles of what he calls evolutionarily stable cooperation, all rooted in this tit-for-tat approach.
Okay, let's hear them. What are these principles?
The first is the ultimatum principle, which boils down to knowing your worth. It means not being afraid to walk away from a deal if it means compromising your values or settling for less than you deserve, even if it's tempting in the moment.
So it's like that old saying, don't let the perfect be the enemy of the good, but in reverse, don't let good enough rob you of what's truly valuable.
Perfectly put. The second is the Miyagi principle, inspired by Mr. Miyagi from The Karate Kid.
Ah, wax on, wax off. Teaching that true strength comes from within.
Exactly. It's about understanding that strength often lies in restraint. Don't be the first to betray trust, but be prepared to stand your ground if necessary. It's about choosing cooperation as the default setting, but being ready to shift gears if someone tries to take advantage.
So channel your inner Mr. Miyagi, ready to defend, but not spoiling for a fight. I like it. What's the third principle?
The sucker principle, which emphasizes that while cooperation is good, letting yourself be repeatedly exploited is not. It reminds us that reciprocity is key. Respond to kindness with kindness, but don't hesitate to stand up against those who try to take advantage.
It's about recognizing that true cooperation can only exist when there's mutual respect and a willingness to play by the rules. What about the final principle?
The clarity principle, keep your intentions and strategies clear. Don't try to be overly clever or manipulative. When you're straightforward and transparent, it fosters trust and makes it more likely others will cooperate.
Because confusion breeds mistrust, which can quickly unravel even the best intentions. But where does this leave us, the listeners? What's the takeaway from this deep dive into the world of game theory and these hidden games?
Here's what I hope you take away from this. Start seeing the world through this lens of game theory. Ask yourself, what are the rules of the games I'm playing? Who are the players? And what are their motivations? Once you start seeing these patterns, you can anticipate challenges, make more strategic decisions, and even start to influence the game itself. Never forget that, even in a world full of complex systems and seemingly insurmountable challenges, you have agency. You have the power to make choices, to build coalitions, and to create a better future one game at a time.
Until next time, play on. Okay, so we're diving into some pretty heady stuff today with this Metarevolutionary Manifesto. You sent this excerpt over, and wow, it's dense. But I think it might actually help us understand not just like what's going on in the world, but what we can actually do about it.
Yeah, you know what I find so interesting about it? It really captures this feeling I think a lot of us have, that it's not even just like one crisis at a time anymore. It's like this whole swirling mess, which is what the author calls a metacrisis, right? It's like all these separate problems are all connected.
Yeah, it's like that everything's broken feeling.
Yeah.
But they use the example of a meaning crisis.
Yeah.
And that really got me thinking. Because it's not just like the economy's a mess or climate change is scary. It's like we've lost a sense of purpose, like on a societal level.
And that's why all the usual ways we try to fix things, it doesn't work, The manifesto, it argues that we've got to completely change how we think, starting with this idea of the hyperorganism.
What exactly is a hyperorganism? This is starting to sound like a sci-fi movie, I got to be honest.
It does. But it's actually not a new idea. In fact, the manifesto, it mentions Plato's Republic, where he talks about like society and how it mirrors the way our minds work. But then, of course, you have those like scarier versions of this idea, like, Hobbes' Leviathan.
Right, that giant all-powerful, that's not a good look.
Not a good look. And that's the thing, Leviathan, it's like a warning.
Right.
Collective power without any ethics, it's dangerous. And that's what's different about the meta-revolution idea. It's about guiding the hyperorganism in a positive direction.
So the hyperorganism, we're talking about like us, humans, plus all the systems we've created.
Exactly. Everything. All interconnected.
So it's not just about being like swept along by this hyperorganism. We can actually steer it. But how? That's like trying to steer a runaway train.
Well, that's the thing, right? The manifesto, it focuses on 2 key upgrades we need. First, we have to boost our collective intelligence.
Okay.
And second, we have to actually expand our senses to perceive like the hyperorganism's experience.
Wait, expanding our senses.
Yeah.
Okay, now you're messing with me. How do you even grasp what a hyperorganism feels, if it even can feel.
That's where the idea of an internet of senses comes in.
Oh, wait.
Imagine, like, integrating data from everywhere, and I mean everywhere, including from non-human senses, to get the full picture of what the hyperorganism is experiencing.
Hold on. Give me an example. I need an example.
Okay, so think about a carrier pigeon.
Okay.
They can sense the Earth's magnetic field, right?
Right.
Or how some animals can see beyond the human visual spectrum.
Okay.
If we can tap into that kind of data, we could have a much richer understanding of how everything's connected, not just what we see happening, but how the whole planet is experiencing it.
So it's like developing a planetary empathy, not just knowing about problems, but actually feeling them.
Exactly. And that empathy, it's crucial for us to make ethical choices. Choices that benefit everyone, not just a select few, the entire hyperorganism.
Okay, that makes sense.
Yeah.
But it also brings up some, concerns. Even if we could create this global brain, expand our senses, what about trust? Historically powerful systems, they become centralized, they become controlling, even tyrannical. How do we prevent that from happening here?
You're right to be cautious. The manifesto actually talks about that. It even mentions Tim Lu's book, The Master Switch, and how decentralized technologies, they tend to become centralized over time. But it also offers a potential solution, blockchain.
Okay, good, because I was about to ask about that. So explain this. How does blockchain play into this whole hyperorganism situation?
Okay, so think about banks. They're like the centralized middleman.
Right.
You need them to guarantee trust in financial transactions. Blockchains, specifically technologies like Ethereum, they have the potential to completely decentralize that trust. They allow for direct interaction, peer-to-peer, without needing that powerful intermediary.
So instead of relying on one big bank, we all have access to this secure, transparent system.
Exactly.
Okay, I'm starting to see where you're going with this.
And if we can decentralize something as fundamental as money, imagine the possibilities for other systems within the hyperorganism, right?
Mm-hmm.
Collective decision-making, how we manage resources, even how we govern ourselves.
That's a pretty radical shift. But let's be real. Even with a decentralized system, complex systems, by their very nature, they're fragile. Things break down, disruptions happen. How do we make sure this hyperorganism can actually withstand all the inevitable bumps in the road?
Such a crucial point. And the manifesto, it actually addresses that head on. It talks about fragility versus antifragility.
Okay.
It leans on the work of Nassim Taleb. He argues that truly resilient systems, they don't just withstand shocks, they get stronger because of them.
So it's not just about weathering the storm, it's about using the storm to grow.
Exactly. Like, imagine a house that's built in a way that it doesn't just resist earthquakes, it actually gets reinforced by them.
I like the way you think. Okay. That's a much more hopeful way to look at things. But I do have to ask, this all sounds great in theory, but how do you actually coordinate action on such a massive scale? We're talking about a global hyperorganism.
Right.
Billions of people. It seems impossible to get everyone on the same page without some central authority calling the shots.
Well, that's where this really fascinating concept comes in. It's called stigmergy.
Stigmergy. Okay. I'm going to need an example for this one. That sounds a little intimidating.
All right. So think about how ants build those complex trails and mounds.
Right.
There's no ant boss, right?
A foreman, yeah.
They're leaving these cues for each other, responding to changes in their environment, and somehow this bigger pattern emerges. It's like the information is embedded in the environment itself. The manifesto says we can actually apply that to human society too.
So like Wikipedia, people from all over the world contribute, but there's no one person in charge.
Exactly. It's self-organization. Manifesto calls this challenge propagation. The problems themselves become the catalyst for action. And the solutions, they come from the bottom up.
So instead of trying to control everything, we create systems that encourage this self-organized response. It's like building resilience from the ground up.
Exactly. Create the right environment, and the hyperorganism, it can adapt and thrive on its own.
Okay, this is a lot to unpack, but it's incredibly thought-provoking. We've talked about collective intelligence, expanding our senses, decentralization, anti-fragility, how to coordinate action on a global scale. But there's one more big piece of the puzzle here that I want to get to, and that is prediction. How do we navigate a world that is constantly in flux, where the future is uncertain, without just relying on guesswork, right?
You're hitting on a really critical point. Because prediction, it's essential for navigating complexity. And the manifesto, it suggests some pretty intriguing ways we can actually get better at it. One connection it makes is to the free energy principle. Basically, this idea that minimizing surprise is key to survival, to thriving. It also talks about the potential of prediction markets as a way to tap into collective intelligence.
Prediction markets. Now, there's a term I haven't heard before. Tell me more.
So imagine a marketplace. But instead of trading goods and services, people are betting on the likelihood of future events. The idea is that by pooling everyone's knowledge, you can get way more accurate predictions than any one person could make on their own.
So it's like betting on the future, but with the added bonus that it could actually help us understand it better.
Exactly. And those predictions, we could use them for all sorts of things.
Like what?
The manifesto talks about informing decision-making in everything from government and policy to business, even personal life choices.
So like governments basing their policies on the collective wisdom of a prediction market instead of just, whoever shouts the loudest.
Precisely.
That could be a game changer. Okay, but before we get too far ahead of ourselves, I want to make sure we address what's probably on everyone's mind right now.
And what's that?
With all this talk of a hyperorganism, this collective intelligence working together on this massive scale, what happens to individual freedom? Where does that fit into all of this?
The age-old question, individual versus the collective, right?
Yeah.
The manifesto actually tackles this head-on, and it says that true freedom, it's not just about having a million options, it's about finding your purpose.
Okay.
Aligning your actions with, and this is their term, with the good.
So less about, I can do whatever I want, and more about, I'm choosing to contribute to something bigger than myself.
Yes. And here's the thing, that pursuit of purpose, it's not at odds with the hyperorganism at all. When the hyperorganism is functioning well, it actually enhances individual freedom. It creates the conditions where everyone can thrive, where everyone has the opportunity to reach their full potential.
So it's this kind of like beautiful synergistic relationship, individual growth and the development of like a more ethical, functional hyperorganism, all going hand in hand.
Precisely. It's not either or, it's both. It's about finding that balance, right?
Yeah.
Between what we can do as individuals and our responsibility to the collective. But this idea of aligning with the good,
Right.
That's a pretty big concept to unpack, and I think there's a lot of room for interpretation there.
There really is. And, this manifesto is just full of these philosophical questions. And one of the most intriguing ones is this idea of a hypergame. It's like it's saying, before we can even try to tackle these huge problems, we have to choose the right game to play.
It's fascinating, right? And it's so relevant to everything we've been discussing, and it goes even deeper. The manifesto, it actually proposes creating a DAO specifically to explore these different games.
A DAO.
Yeah.
Like what is it? Decentralized autonomous organization.
Yeah.
For playing games. Okay, I got to admit, that sounds a little out there.
But think about it. If you could take different game scenarios, like the prisoner's dilemma, right?
Okay, yeah.
And translate those into smart contracts, put them on a blockchain, we could actually simulate the outcomes of all these different choices, different strategies.
So it's like we're building a giant simulator, basically.
Yeah.
To test out different ways of, like, organizing ourselves, right? See what works, what doesn't, but without any real-world consequences.
Exactly.
Like a choose-your-own-adventure for humanity.
Yes. And here's the beauty of a DAO. It's open to everyone.
Right.
So we could crowdsource solutions, get everyone involved, tap into that collective intelligence of the hyperorganism to find better ways of playing the game of life.
Okay. I love the ambition, but I don't know, it's a little daunting, right? Like, where do you even begin? How do you choose which games do you even play in this DAO? What makes a good game versus a bad one?
Yeah, and the manifesto acknowledges that. There's no easy answer. There's no one-size-fits-all. It's an ongoing process.
Okay.
We have to experiment. We try things. We see how they play out. And then we adapt. We learn as we go.
So it's less about finding that one perfect solution. It's more about just constantly trying to, like, refine our approach as we get more information.
Exactly. But, the manifesto also makes it clear. This journey, it's not just about external systems and structures.
Okay.
It's about individual transformation, too.
Okay.
We have to develop certain qualities, cultivate them within ourselves. Love, compassion, wisdom, being willing to look beyond our own limited perspectives.
So it's inner work and outer work. Both are crucial for, like, navigating this complex world and trying to nudge the hyperorganism in the right direction.
Precisely. The manifesto, it argues that true freedom, it's not just about maximizing options, it's about aligning your actions with this greater good.
Right.
Recognizing that we are all connected and choosing to play games that benefit everyone.
Okay, I can get behind that. But there's still this, I don't know, this question in the back of my mind. What about the people who don't want to play? The people who are like, hyperorganism, I don't buy it. Or they just really prioritize their own individual freedom above all else. How do they fit into this vision of the future?
It's a really good question, and the manifesto actually addresses it. It says that a healthy hyperorganism, it can't be coercive.
Right.
It has to emerge from people choosing to participate. It has to respect individual differences, allow for a diversity of perspectives.
So it's about like building a system that's flexible enough, inclusive enough to make space for all of that.
Exactly. It's a balancing act for sure. And the manifesto doesn't pretend it's going to be easy.
This whole hypergame concept, as much as it's about these large-scale systems, it really does come down to the choices that we make individually, doesn't it? Like, what kind of world do I want to live in? What kind of game do I want to play? So it's not just one big decision. It's this constant process of choosing, adapting, course-correcting as we go.
Yeah.
Like a never-ending game of chess where every move has these ripple effects that we can't even predict.
Perfect analogy. And the manifesto points out, a lot of times, we get stuck playing these games that are, in the end, self-defeating.
Okay.
Games that prioritize the short term over the long term. Competition instead of cooperation. And ultimately, those lead to outcomes that are bad for everyone.
Yeah, we can all probably think of a few examples of those games playing out in the world right now. So how do we break out of those patterns then? How do we, as individuals, as a collective, start choosing those games that are more cooperative, more beneficial, to the whole hyperorganism?
That's really what this whole hypergame concept comes down to, right? It's a choice. What kind of world do we want to create? What kind of game do we want to play? Not just as individuals, but as a species.
Exactly. And that brings us to a really interesting proposition in the manifesto.
Okay.
What if, instead of trying to force everyone to play by the same rules, what if we created a space where we could experiment with different models? Different ways of cooperating, governing. So like a testing ground for new forms of social organization, a place to prototype different futures.
The manifesto suggests that this is where DAOs could be really powerful, not just as tools for managing resources or making decisions, but as spaces for social experimentation.
Like laboratories for experimenting with different ways of, organizing ourselves, almost like prototyping different futures.
It's about empowering all these different perspectives, seeing what actually works.
This is really interesting. I have to admit, we started with this idea of a hyperorganism. Yeah. And it felt, I don't know, kind of big and scary, like something we couldn't control. But now it's starting to feel like maybe we can have some influence, Like this global interconnectedness is happening, whether we like it or not. But if we approach it the right way, maybe you can steer it in a direction that benefits everybody.
And that's really the core message of the manifesto, isn't it? It's not about being afraid of how complex the world is. It's about facing that complexity head on. It's about realizing that we're all players in this and that we have a responsibility to each other to play the game well, to make choices that not only benefit us as individuals, but that create a future where everyone has the opportunity to thrive.
I think that's a great place to leave it. You've given our listeners a lot to think about today. So much, in fact, they will have to pick this up again in a future deep dive.
Absolutely. There's always more to explore.
Okay, so transformation. It's like more than just a self-help buzzword, right? We're talking about like a fundamental force here, something that's driving everything from the tiniest grain of sand to the entire universe. And we're going deep on this one. You sent me some stuff about monads, which honestly, before this, I kind of thought were like a Star Wars thing.
Yeah, a lot of people get tripped up by the terminology, but that's what I think is so cool about this topic. You've got these big philosophical ideas. You mentioned Leibniz, Wilbur, folks like that, but they actually connect to our everyday lives.
Totally. Like we're trying to unlock the secrets of the universe and the secrets of like, ourselves at the same time. But, okay, let's start with these monads. They're like these indivisible units of reality.
Think of them like spiritual atoms, each with its own unique perspective. Leibniz argued that each monad has a different view of what's good, what's valuable. Yeah. And it's the constant interaction and striving of all these monads that drives the process of transformation.
All right, so how does that actually, work? If everything is made up of these monads all trying to become better, in their own way.
Yeah.
How does that translate to, like, my own personal growth?
It's like a dance, kinda. Imagine each monad as a dancer, moving and changing in relation to all the others. Every interaction, every shift in perspective, it's all part of this grand cosmic dance of transformation. And you, as a collection of monads, you're participating in that dance with every choice you make, every action you take.
Okay, so even something as simple as, like, me deciding to learn a new skill or finally confront a bad habit that's part of this whole monad dance.
Exactly. And the more we understand the principles of this dance, the more skillfully we can participate in it. And I think that's where the concepts of depth and development come into play, the two sides of the transformation coin, as you put it.
Right. You can't have one without the other. Right?
Yeah.
Like trying to climb a mountain without actually, going up.
Exactly. Depth is about going inwards, confronting our shadows, grappling with the difficult questions, understanding those parts of ourselves that we might rather keep hidden. But it's in those depths that we often find the greatest potential for growth.
So those moments when you have a sudden realization about yourself, a breakthrough in therapy, or maybe even just like a really honest conversation with a friend, those are glimpses of this depth.
Exactly. Those aha moments, those are signs you're plumbing those depths, confronting your shadows, and coming out with a more complete understanding of yourself.
Okay.
But transformation isn't just about going deep, right? It's also about reaching for something higher, something more expansive.
Which is where development comes in.
Exactly. Development is about expanding our awareness, connecting to something larger than ourselves, striving for greater knowledge, wisdom, and love. It's about actualizing our potential, both as individuals and as a society, too.
So when we talk about things like technological progress or artistic movements or even like the evolution of ethical ideas, we're talking about development on a societal level.
Exactly. And the fascinating thing is that these two movements, depth and development, they're always happening simultaneously, both within ourselves and in the world around us.
So it's this intricate dance where we're constantly going inwards and outward, exploring our depths and reaching for like new heights.
Yes. Precisely. And as we become more skilled at this dance, something incredible happens. We begin to touch on the idea of immortality. Not in the, literal sense of living forever, but in the sense of creating something that endures. What does immortality really mean in the context of, transformation? It's not like we're all secretly hoping to become vampires. Well, unless you are. No judgment here. But you're right, it's not about, evading death. The stuff you shared seems to be pointing at something a lot deeper. It's more about reaching a state where our actions, our very being, it resonates with the good so powerfully that it continues to influence the world even after we're gone.
So it's about leaving a legacy.
Yeah.
But not just building a big company or having your name on a building.
Right. It's not about ego. It's about the impact we have on others, the knowledge we share, the love we put out into the world. It's about recognizing that we're part of something so much larger than ourselves.
And contributing to that, right?
Exactly. Contributing to the ongoing evolution of, the universe, consciousness, whatever you want to call it.
Okay. So it's not really about me becoming immortal. It's about the things that really matter living on in some way.
Yeah, exactly. It's a shift from self-preservation to this focus on contributing to something that will outlive us.
Which, you know what that reminds me of, this whole zombie apocalypse thing they kept popping up in the sources?
Oh, interesting.
What's the deal with that? Are we really going there?
I can't promise we won't encounter a zombie or two on our journey of transformation, but you've hit on something important. The zombie apocalypse, it's a metaphor, for what happens when we lose sight of that connection to something bigger.
Great, yeah.
When we become so focused on individual survival, on power, control, we lose our humanity, our sense of meaning.
So the real zombies are the ones who have lost their connection to the good, to that thing that makes us human.
You got it. They represent a kind of spiritual stagnation, a failure to embrace that transformative journey, the thing that gives life meaning.
Yeah.
And the sources say this isn't just a problem for individuals. It can happen on the societal level, too.
Oh, wow.
Yeah.
Which kind of makes you think about all the division and negativity we see in the world today, right? Is that what they're getting at?
Yeah, it's definitely a possibility worth considering. When we lose sight of the bigger picture, when we become obsessed with these individual or tribal interests, it's we risk creating that world, that zombie apocalypse, a world without meaning, purpose, connection.
Okay, so that's kind of bleak picture.
Sure.
But the sources did talk about some potential solutions, right? Like they mentioned shamanism as a way of like tapping into a deeper understanding.
Yeah, and this is where things get really interesting. Shamans, they're often described as like individuals who've mastered this art of venturing into hidden realms of consciousness.
Okay.
And they bring back insights and wisdom to help their communities.
It's like they have like a map or something
Yeah.
to those hidden dimensions of reality, the ones we don't usually see.
Exactly. And what's fascinating is that these shamanic practices, they often involve altered states of consciousness, through drumming, plant medicine, meditation, things like that.
Right.
And they use these to access these hidden realms.
So it's like we can learn to explore those hidden realms within ourselves too, like find some answers to those big questions about meaning and purpose.
Exactly. And you know what the sources connect this idea to?
What's that?
The ancient practice of alchemy.
But not in the turning lead into gold way, right?
Right. It's more like a metaphor for personal change. Imagine taking all your experiences, the good stuff, the bad stuff, all the messy bits, and refining them into something better, more valuable.
Okay, I can get behind that. So how does this alchemical transformation, how does it actually work? One of the sources mentioned different stages, and each one had a color.
Right. It starts with an agredo, that's the black stage. It represents this death and rebirth. It's like when a caterpillar goes into its cocoon, things have to break down to make space for something new.
So it's about letting go of what's no longer serving us. What comes after that?
Then we have the albedo, the white stage, which is all about purification, cleaning the slate, so to speak. If the negredo is like demolition, the albedo is rebuilding.
Like a fresh start. What's the last stage?
And finally, there's the rubedo, the red stage. This one represents unity, that feeling of completion. The butterfly finally emerges from the cocoon, vibrant and ready for a new way of being.
Wow, that's such a powerful image. It makes you think about your own life, where you might be in those stages. It's like a whole new way of looking at how we grow. But these alchemical processes, they don't happen in a vacuum, do they?
You're right. They're connected to all the symbolic language around us. Myths, stories, even simple everyday symbols, they all speak to us on a deeper level. Think of a symbol that really speaks to maybe a religious image, something from nature, even a brand logo.
That's so true. I've always been drawn to symbols, like mandalas, for example. They can communicate these complex spiritual ideas, but it's all in a single image.
And when we understand that language, we can start to see hidden meanings everywhere. It's like these little whispers of wisdom guiding us on our own journeys of transformation. Imagine everyone working together to build this shared understanding, a symbolic language that captures not just scientific truths, but moral and spiritual ones too.
So instead of just figuring out the meaning of symbols that already exist, we would be creating new ones, working together to make a world that's more meaningful and interconnected.
The sources suggest that this universal language, it wouldn't just be about words, it would be about symbols, archetypes, these patterns that speak to something deeper within us.
So it's like a language that speaks to our souls.
Exactly. And the sources suggest that this language, it might be the key to unlocking a deeper understanding of transformation, to seeing these patterns, these connections that are often hidden from view. It's a language that could help us navigate the complexities of our world.
Yeah.
And create a future that's more aligned with the good.
Okay, now you're really making me think. But how do we actually learn to speak this language? Where do we even start? So we're talking about learning a new language, but not like one with grammar rules and vocabulary lists.
Yeah.
More like learning to read the signs, the symbols that are already out there.
That's it. It's about cultivating a different kind of awareness. It's not about finding one right answer. It's about constantly growing, always getting a better understanding. It's about embracing the fact that things are always changing.
I love that. But it seems incredibly complicated, too. Where would we even begin to create a language everyone could understand?
Well, one source mentioned a philosopher named Leibniz from way back in the 17th century. He tried to create something called a characteristica universalis, which was like a universal language for all knowledge.
So people have been thinking about this for centuries. It's like we're picking up where they left off, still searching for that deeper understanding. The more we pay attention, the more we start to see the signs, the messages.
It's like tuning into a frequency we couldn't hear before. And as we become more attuned to this language, this characteristica universalis, we can participate in the transformative process in a more conscious, deliberate way. We can align ourselves with the good, act in ways that support a more beautiful, more meaningful world.
So it's like we're all becoming alchemists, learning to transform not just ourselves, but the world around us too.
That's beautifully put. And the sources remind us this isn't just some abstract idea. It's a practice, a way of life. It's about the choices we make, the actions we take, the relationships we build, and aligning all of that with the good, with the highest values we can imagine. It's a journey. And like any good journey, having a map can make all the difference. If we can work together to create this shared language of values, it's not just about understanding ourselves and the world better. We start giving each other these signposts, these reminders of the kind of world we're trying to create.
It's like having this giant vision board for humanity, a way to keep us all focused on that goal of a world that's more just, more compassionate, and more connected.
I love that. And what's so powerful about this is that we don't need to have all the answers figured out beforehand. It's an ongoing conversation, a constant process of learning and creating together. We can tap into the collective wisdom of everyone who's ever lived, face the challenges of our time and work towards a better future.
So, as we wrap up this amazing deep dive, what's the one thing you really hope sticks with our listeners? What's the most important takeaway?
If I had to pick just one, it would be this. You matter. You're not just watching the world go by, you're an active participant in creating it. Embrace that transformative power of love. Let it guide your decisions, your actions, how you treat others. And never underestimate the impact, even of the smallest act of kindness, compassion, or bravery.
Those are powerful words to carry with us. This has been an incredible journey exploring these ideas with you. And you know what? After this deep dive, I feel this renewed sense of hope, like a deeper understanding of how connected we all are, and a real urge to go out and live with more love. So thank you for guiding us through all of this.
The pleasure was all mine. Just remember, the journey of transformation, it never really ends. Stay curious, stay engaged, and never stop exploring what you're capable of. The possibilities for a world united by love, they're limitless.
That's a powerful message. And honestly, I think it's something we could all use a little more of these days. It's a good reminder that even in the middle of all the chaos, all the uncertainty, there's always hope. Always the possibility for transformation, for creating something better. And that's something worth striving for, right?
Absolutely.